Good morning and welcome to the Collaborative on Health and the Environment Alaska teleconference on the connection between the environment and breast cancer. My name is Samantha Englishu, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. CHE Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment. CHE Alaska aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. You can find more information on the websites www.healthandenvironment.org and www.akaction.org. The call will last 1 hour. Except for the speakers, all participants are muted during the presentations. There will be time for discussion and questions towards the end of the call. I would like to note we have a bilingual Spanish-English speaker present on the call to translate questions. There is also a blog set up for this call, so if you think of questions during the presentation, we invite you to post them to the blog, and we will do our best to get to them during the discussion time. To access the blog, go to healthandenvironment.org, click on News and Events, and then on Working Group Calls, you will find today's call listed there. Today we will be hearing from Jeanne Rizzo, President and CEO of the Breast Cancer Fund. She will be discussing the 6th edition of the Landmark Science Report, State of the Evidence, the Connection Between Breast Cancer and the Environment, which evaluates the scientific evidence linking exposures to chemicals and radiation in our everyday environments to increased breast cancer risk. She will also present findings from a new study by the Breast Cancer Fund and Silent Spring Institute on bisphenol A, BPA, and food packaging and talk about ways to become involved in breast cancer prevention. It's my pleasure to welcome and introduce our speaker. Jeanne is a founding partner of the Collaborative on Health and the Environment and the Campaign for Safe Cosmetics. She is Council Chair of the California Breast Cancer Research Program and is an appointed member of the National Institute of Health Interagency Breast Cancer and Environment Research Coordinating Committee. She is the recipient of the EPA Region 9 Green Chemistry Environmental Leader Award. A nurse, then award-winning music, theater, and film producer, she produced the documentary Climb Against the Odds, Mount McKinley. For those participants calling from within Alaska, Jeanne is doing a lecture tour starting tonight in Anchorage, 7 p.m. lecture, 6:30 p.m. reception at the Anchorage Museum. Tomorrow, she will be speaking in Fairbanks at the UAF Scheibel Auditorium, 7 p.m. lecture. And she will be in Homer this Friday, 7 p.m. lecture at the Pratt Museum. All locations are free and open to the public. Thank you again, Jeanne, for presenting today. Would you like to begin?
Thank you, Samantha, and thank you to all of you for being on this call today. It's such a privilege to be here with ACAT, all the staff here under the leadership of Pam Miller. I have been a long-time admirer of Pam's work, and all of you should know that when Pam takes the message of the issues in Alaska around the country, she is a fierce advocate, and we have all learned much from her. So on the anniversary week of the birthday of Rachel Carson, I think it's a great day to be here with all of you. The Breast Cancer Fund is based in San Francisco. We're a national organization, and our mission is very focused. In response to the public health crisis of breast cancer, we identify and advocate for the elimination of the environmental and other preventable causes of the disease. We didn't get there lightly, and we didn't get there easily. Breast cancer is a devastating disease, and there is much to do in the area of screening, treatment, and access to care. What we looked at in 2001 was the fact that there were not adequate voices bringing attention to the fact that there was a causation issue that we were not addressing, and that there was a connection between environmental toxins and breast cancer, and we needed to step up to that and bring voice to that. So that's when we, working together on the first edition of State of the Evidence with colleagues in San Francisco Breast Cancer Action, we published the first of what now are 6 editions. In 2009, the 5th edition of State of the Evidence was published in the International Journal of Occupational and Environmental Health, both the science part of our report and the policy part. So I draw your attention to the fact that we do 2 things in this report. We talk about the framework of the science, the actual scientific evidence, and then go on to talk about how you can take the science and move it into action. Today we will focus on the 2010 edition. The 2010 6th edition. So when you think about breast cancer, you think about who is at risk. Well, being a woman is the primary risk factor, of course, for breast cancer, but increasingly we are seeing men being diagnosed. And this is of particular concern because it speaks to the incredible hormonal overload that it takes to have a man convert into breast cancer. We see this in a very dramatic example in Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, where over 50 military that were exposed to solvents in the water have been diagnosed. These are men diagnosed with breast cancer. I know that military exposures are of great concern to Alaska, and I certainly encourage you to stay on top of that. I think it's a significant factor that we will learn more about over time as we insist on more transparency. The President's Cancer Panel report that was issued to President Obama from an independent science panel this last year on cancer and the environment, what we can do now, made a huge point of talking about military exposures. We've all heard the traditional risk factors of family history, reproductive history, age of first child and lactation, age of puberty, menopause, obesity, alcohol, diet, and stress. We know that the decisions that we have made on factors that are not the traditional risk factors, those that are not within our control, have already taken their toll. That's what we're going to look at. As over 200,000 women in the United States will hear that they have invasive breast cancer, close to 50,000 will seek treatment for ductal carcinoma in situ, and 40,000 will die. In Alaska, breast cancer is the #1 female cancer, and 1/3 of all female cancers in Alaska are breast cancer. So when we start to talk about the breast cancer incidence and mortality, I do want to compliment the fact that Alaska now has a cancer registry, which I hope is going to build over time. It's a little hard to tease out the nuances within the registry of race and ethnicity, geography, and I think those are important. Even when people say that the numbers are small and they're not statistically significant, they are significant to that individual woman who's been diagnosed, to that community who is seeing it. So I really encourage you to continue to work with those registries and to see that every single diagnosis is recorded so that you can be attentive to it. As I said, you rank, I don't know if I did, that you rank 14th in breast cancer in the United States in incidence and 5th in mortality. 1 in 8 women in the United States will be diagnosed with breast cancer in her lifetime. There's a difference in disparity in the mortality rates of breast cancer. We know that in the United States, generally, African American women are more likely to die of breast cancer. I think you have found with your own native Alaska population that you're at greater risk for mortality in that population than across the rest of the population. So again, it's very important as you look at what are the factors that contribute to the likelihood of mortality from breast cancer. Some of those are the kind of breast cancer that women are being diagnosed with, whether it's triple-negative breast cancer, and there are other factors like access to care, adequate treatment, that contribute to whether or not a woman survives. But what we haven't pulled out are what are those environmental factors that are provoking early onset puberty, which is a later life risk of breast cancer, and other depleted health and immune systems that can contribute to higher mortality of breast cancer. So what we have here is, since 1972, something that was called the War on Cancer. So I always ask, how is it going? How is this war on cancer that President Nixon announced in 1972? And have we been in the right theater on that? Well, we know that the traditional risk factor list that I gave you a few minutes ago is the same one that we had in 1972. The focus during that time has been primarily on mammography as screening, despite the fact that we understand there are concerns about exposure to radiation from mammography. We've had a reduction in mortality, but not across all demographics. Treatment is better and less toxic, but we have now normalized cancer. It's pretty much expected that we will get cancer. Now the question is, how bad will the treatment be? Access to care is improved, but not for everyone. We've identified 2 genes related to breast cancer, the BRCA genes, but what we also know is that women with those genes have a dramatically increased risk of breast cancer than they did in the 1940s. We pay a lot of attention to breast conservation and reconstruction, horrible choices that women will endure as they face this disease. So we would say that that this has not been a successful attempt to deal with breast cancer. All we've seen is breast cancer rates continue to go up or to plateau, and the only thing that caused breast cancer incidence rates to drop in any dramatic fashion from 1 in 7 to back to 1 in 8 was menopausal hormone replacement therapy. Women who were on that were in a study, and and it was determined midway through the study that they had to halt it because there was a 26 to 42% increase in breast cancer in the women who were on menopausal hormone replacement therapy. Within 3 or 4 years and they had to be on that HRT for 4 years. So then we began to see a drop in breast cancer as millions of women flooded off those drugs. So here we had a chemical that was a hormone that was totally approved, that was put into the system, that women did not know was a carcinogen. It is now identified as a carcinogen. The doctors prescribing it didn't know it was a carcinogen, and it took advocates, people concerned about the relationship between hormones and breast cancer, to actually cause that study to happen, to push for the Women's Health Initiative, and that resulted in HRT becoming a very suspect chemical and a hard choice for women to make. So that goes to the core of this, is what do we mean by breast cancer prevention? And we are talking about primary prevention. That means preventing breast cancer before it starts, whether that means looking in utero, at pregnant women, at early childhood, at adolescence, at young women, because breast cancer has a long latency period. So prevention, when we think about it, is not screening. Screening tells you have breast cancer, or maybe that you don't, but it doesn't protect you, and it doesn't really have an increased benefit for mortality in many age groups. It's also not dramatically effective for young women whose breasts are dense. So we have a problem of it's not totally effective, it's radiation, and it's not prevention. So when we talk about prevention, we're talking about eliminating chemicals and agents when there is evidence of harm, reducing exposure to radiation, screening all new chemicals for their long-term effects before they go on the market. So HRT would have had a different model of screening. And investing in green chemistry for safer alternatives. That's a way where you actually design chemicals and formulate and engineer them and test them for their safety before. That's the only way we will protect public health. So I'd like to get into a little bit now of what the framework is of how we look at breast cancer, the state of the methodology. I'll let you read the state of the evidence. For those of you who are deep science wonks, we can talk a little bit about that, but I think that will be of interest to you. Then how we bridge the science into action. So we've already talked about the known risk factors, and I want to talk about the fact that breast cancer does not sit alone. It is part of a bigger environmental health issue. The environmental exposures are associated with a number of negative health outcomes, many of which affect the same families, the same communities as breast cancer does. Other reproductive tissue cancers, reproductive dysfunction, thyroid dysfunction and cancer, neurodevelopment and neurodegenerative disease, learning disorders, autism, and asthma. Those are some of the key factors. So whether you're working in the environmental health and justice, faith-based group, public health, workers' rights, there's something of concern for you that whatever it is that you pay attention to, you will have a positive impact on a number of health outcomes. We also have to say that breast cancer is not a simple disease. It is not one cancer. It is a complex disease with a complex framework of causality. Multiple factors play a role. While we know that only 5 to 10% of breast cancer is associated with those BRCA genes, we also know that a number of things affect those genes from the environment. That's a field that you probably have heard other Che calls when you talk about epigenetics, which is the influence of environment on genes, which can have a multi-generational effect. So it's not that BRCA gene that has been passed down for generation and generation. It's a gene that was affected by environment, and a generation or two later you see the impact. This was dramatically brought home with DES, which was given to pregnant women 2 generations later. We saw women with reproductive breast cancer, ovarian cancer as a result of it. Breast cancer is also a disease of long latency. So we have to understand that there can be decades between exposure, lifestyle issues, hormonal exposures, and when you actually are diagnosed with breast cancer. So that latency period is very important to think about, and it brings us back to how we protect the most vulnerable, which in terms of breast cancer we're understanding now are early life protections. There are 85,000 chemicals in commerce. There's about 1,000 more entered every year. Only 7% of those chemicals have ever been tested for health and environment, and 90% have never been tested at all for their effect on human health. 62,000 chemicals were grandfathered in the 1970s when the Toxic Substance Control Act was put in place. So most Americans assume that those industrial chemicals have been tested for their safety. Well, they have not. And even worse, we've only banned or restricted 5 or 10 of those chemicals through this process of TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act. Bisphenol A, which we'll talk a little bit more later, is one of those chemicals. So I also want to point out that we talk a lot in the environmental health movement about the overhaul of Toxic Substance Control Act. I want you to know that that is not the only place where chemicals are regulated in the federal government. That's the EPA, and it regulates a host of chemicals. It does not regulate pesticides, which I know is of great concern here in Alaska, and it doesn't regulate things that the FDA does, like cosmetics, like pharmaceuticals, like medical devices. So it's very important that we be vigilant and recognize that a lot of the chemicals that we're talking about that we're exposed to are under different agencies. You can find those agencies listed in the the Science to Action section of State of the Evidence. So if you're looking at a particular area of concern, you can see where to go for those. So I want to talk a little bit about we address the vulnerable populations in our State of the Evidence: workers, farm workers, health and factory workers, downwinders, fence line, no line I call them, because there is no line that protects no boundary for the disproportionately affected. We've now just erased all those protective boundaries. We talk about race and ethnicity, and I think you'll find some interesting information on that. Now, these chemicals that are in the environment, what happens to them? Well, we know that they get into our bodies. We know that they have not only just gotten into our bodies from the air we drink, the food we eat, what we put on our bodies, because our skin is a big organ, but we're also finding that they're getting into the bodies of the infant in utero as a result of their ability to cross the placenta. That was something that 20 years ago, and certainly when I studied nursing, the placenta was an absolute barrier. The placenta is not a barrier. So we're seeing chemicals that can transfer into that developing fetus and cause immeasurable harm. And we know this because of biomonitoring studies that have been done on the federal level by the CDC, NHANES, and by biomonitoring studies that have been done by advocacy organizations around the country to look at what is getting into our bodies. And this chemical trespass is significant. So, hundreds of chemicals have literally been found in cord blood, in urine, in blood, in breast tissue. A recent survey of these substances that have gotten into our body by the Silent Spring Institute demonstrated 216 chemicals and radiation sources have been registered by some international or national agency as implicated in breast cancer causation. We have to decide, and we could spend a lot of time on risk versus hazard versus precaution, and we could look at what does it take to prove something is harmful. Is experiment in animals enough? Do we have to experiment on ourselves? What's enough proof? If It causes mammary tumors in the same experiments that a pharmaceutical company would say, oh, this is safe because I tested it on these animals. Is that good enough? Is that good enough for us to say it's harmful? So the key here is really teasing out and understanding what is proof of harm and what is proof of safety. So I'd like to focus a little bit on hormones in breast cancer. Many of the environmental chemicals that we are concerned about are a combination of carcinogens and endocrine disruptors. Endocrine disruptors are those chemicals that literally just drive our hormone systems crazy. However they're synthesized, our body is tricked into thinking they're a hormone, and it responds as if they're a hormone. So many of the environmental chemicals that we talk about are carcinogens and endocrine disruptors or just endocrine disruptors. We've already talked about the menopausal hormonal replacement therapy. Oral contraceptives fall into that category. Placenta, which is used in personal care products marketed to African American women, and I don't know if that's an issue here, but it's worth looking at, that has now been identified as a significant, and it's used on young children. And it's causing breast budding, early breast budding in children exposed to the placental products. Fertility drugs are a new area of concern and one that we can't be afraid to look at over time. So those are the hormonal pieces of it. And we know that a woman's lifetime exposure to estrogen increases her risk, and as I said, we know many act like these chemicals. The other categories of chemicals that we're concerned about are solvents, metals, tobacco smoke, dioxin, the persistent organic chlorines, DDT, PCBs. I think you've addressed a number of those, flame retardants. The other hormonally active chemical that I want to spend a few minutes on, and I'll segue into talking about our study, is bisphenol A, or BPA. Now, this was actually synthesized, I think, back in the 1890s and was determined not to have any valuable use. It was taken back off the shelf in an effort to see if it could function as an estrogen therapy to stave off miscarriage in women because it was hormonally active. It was determined that it was too unstable. It's a polymer. It was unstable. It wasn't really working effectively, so it was put on the shelf again. I don't know who these guys are that find this, but anyway, they found BPA again and decided, you know, this is going to be really good to make as a building block for polycarbonate plastic. And we can make the lining of food cans and so safe that we can protect against any possible botulism in our food can system. And we can use it just in a host of products and materials. So BPA was formulated again into what is now a ubiquitous use of plastic. If you look at a plastic container and it has a number 7 on the bottom, and it does not say BPA free, I will say that it has BPA in it. It is a 95% likelihood that it has bisphenol A in it. It is a really, really toxic chemical and one that is rising in the consciousness around the country and in the federal government. But it takes just so much to turn it from being so likely to cause harm to actually being regulated. And so what we did with BPA, people had tested food in the food cans with those nice white linings, right, those nice easy-to-use food cans, to determine whether the bisphenol A was leaching out of the food cans and into the food. Hundreds and hundreds of these were done by consumer groups around the country. Definitely the BPA was getting into the food. We were trying to pass a BPA legislation in California, and the argument was, yes, but it just doesn't get into the people. Well, logic tells you if it's in the food that you're eating, there's a really good chance that but that was the resistance. The resistance was whether or not the source of it was actually the food packaging. So with the Silent Spring Institute, we conducted a study, and that studies take a long time. This was probably, 15, 16 months from the day of the idea to the actual publishing of the study in Environmental Health Perspectives, which is a very highly regarded national journal under the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. What we did is we recruited 5 families. It was sort of a blind survey done to pick 2 adults and 2 children and 5 families as a demonstration study, who ate within a very average range of food products, some fresh, some canned, some packaged, some, they transported their food in a variety of containers, and we tested their urine at the outset. All of them had at least or above the national average of BPA in their urine. And that is not a good average, by the way, because 93% of us are carrying bisphenol A in our bodies. We then totally controlled everything that they ate, the packaging that it came in, or that it ever came in. So we had farmers market fresh fruit transported in glass jars, cooked by a chef with nothing that had ever touched BPA. It was quite an ordeal to say, we're going to feed 5 families, including children, and have them bring their food in stainless steel containers and kind of be geeks at school and not have the usual little plastic containers for their food. But we did. And we did that for 3 days. At the end of 3 days, the average drop in BPA levels was 66%. We turned around then and let them go back to their, and said, go back to your normal eating. Regardless of what you've learned, just go back to your regular eating. Their BPA levels went right back up to where they were. It tells us that BPA leaves your body pretty quickly. The damage it does on the way out is of one concern. But it tells us that the food packaging was the source, and that by eliminating food packaging with BPA, you can actually reduce your exposure significantly. So the levels dropped 66%, which was well below the national average. It wasn't totally zero. So there are other sources of BPA exposure, but it was pretty dramatic, and that study has garnered a tremendous amount of attention, and demonstrates for us our need to continue. There's BPA legislation in the U.S. Congress. In California, we fell short again. We've been working on it for 5 years, but there are about 19 states and municipalities around the country who have made some kind of effort successfully to ban BPA from baby bottles and sippy cups, and infant formula is the next big hurdle to get past infant formula. What it has also done, though, the attention to this, and this is where the advocacy comes in, as a result of our bringing attention to the presence of BPA in infant baby bottles, you can hardly find a BPA baby bottle in California right now. So it shifted the market. So there's a number of ways that you can change this. One of them has to do with regulation, but you can push regulation with the market, and you can push the market with regulation. So I want to draw attention to that. Second big category of hormones related to breast cancer are the phthalates. And this is a class of chemicals that you've probably heard a lot about. And there's a host of them. And they are found literally in everything. They are one of the most common endocrine disrupting compounds that have been linked to several disorders, not just breast cancer. They're in plastic toys, baby chew toys. They make the plastic soft and malleable. So they might be in the tubing, the IV tubing in the neonatal intensive care unit, for example, which is not a good place for them to be. Kaiser has worked really hard to remove in California, all phthalates from their medical devices. It's found in cosmetics and personal care products. It makes your nail polish stay on better for some reason that I don't understand. It's in building materials. It's in cleaning materials. It's in insecticides. It's in the air and dust samples taken in residential buildings. It's when biomonitored, all U.S. adults and children have phthalates in their bodies, and it's in breast milk. Phthalates have been found in breast tumor tissue. So animal studies have shown this is what's unique about BPA, and with some of the phthalates that I didn't mention before. They can act at doses that are not just high doses. they can act at really low doses to create greater harm. And that's something that really throws this theory that we have lived under, that the dose makes the poison. We've lived with that theory, that Paracelsus theory, goes all the way back to the 1500s. It says the dose makes the poison. When we look at chemicals like BPA and some of the phthalates, we have to be really conscious of the fact that low doses can lead to greater abnormalities in cells and in experimental science than high doses do. And in young girls, higher level of phthalates in their bodies are connected significantly to breast tissue development. The removal of those phthalates from that exposure have literally caused breast tissue to recede and to reduce. So we know that the age of puberty has fallen, and it's fallen in different demographics differently. And what we're coming to understand through studies that have been funded under NIEHS and through our own report, which is called Falling Age of Puberty by Dr. Sandra Steingraber, what we know is that it's not just the age of menstruation. That's always been what people think. That's the age of puberty. It's an entire process that is puberty. One piece of it is breast budding. We are seeing very dramatic and early breast budding in young girls. We're seeing 5, 6, 7-year-old girls breast budding. They maybe have not had their periods yet, but they have breast buds. We're also finding this to be a very conflicted area because you talk to healthcare professionals. How do you examine for that? What do you do when you find it? How do you deal with parents? So one thing that the medical profession has looked at is dropping what the normal age of puberty is, as opposed to helping us deal with the fact that we have a puberty crisis that is also connected to early life obesity. So you've got a cycle of these chemicals contributing to early childhood obesity, contributing to puberty, and also contributing to the difficulty in being able to discern what a medical professional is seeing. Are they seeing fat or are they seeing breast, and how do you deal with that? So it's a big, big issue, and I really I just want to bring us back to that so that we don't lose track of the fact that our little girls are in trouble here. Some other endocrine disrupting chemicals that we won't go into a lot of discussion about, but are explored deeply in state of the evidence, are parabens, flame retardants, sunscreens, a host of herbicides and pesticides. The other breast carcinogens that are outlined in the book are solvents like benzene, vinyl chloride, 1,3-butadiene, which is an air pollutant. Metals are increasing knowledge and information about the issue of metals exposure in breast cancer, dioxin, and then, of course, ionizing radiation. I want to bring us back to that because it's controversial, and it's a tough one to talk about because it has been the hallmark of breast cancer screening for so long, and also because we know that it is involved in the treatment of cancers and in the screening and diagnosing of many diseases and conditions. What we do know is that ionizing radiation is cumulative. There is absolutely no 100% safe dose. It accumulates. What triggers the ionizing of your genes or yours, is a factor that we don't understand. So how many chest x-rays on top of your dental x-rays, on top of your mammograms, on top of that sprained ankle that you decided to see if it was broken, and the CT scan that somebody thought you should have when you were a kid and you bumped your head? At what point does that lead to increased risk of not just breast cancer, but including breast cancer? So, and the overuse of medical radiation and the lack of thoughtfulness on all of our parts in really asking the question, do we really need that? I'm not suggesting that if you need radiation for treatment that you shouldn't have it. I am suggesting that we should find an alternative to screening for breast cancer that is not radiation, especially when we're talking about exposing women in their 30s and 40s for 30 years worth of mammography. While it's a low dose, we're also understanding that low dose radiation is not without some of its own unique concerns, just the same way as low-dose chemical exposure. So I think that we have to pay attention to that. It's a really hard set of decisions that people have to make about, I'm not suggesting people don't have a mammogram. And we know that MRIs and ultrasounds contribute to a diagnostic suite of possibilities. We know that thermography is not getting the job done, if that's something that has been raised here. So we don't have an absolute good screening that is non-invasive and non-harmful. That said, you have to make an individual decision about it, and you really have to talk candidly and raise that question, because all radiation that you're exposed to has potential down the line to cause breast cancer. The other issue that is bubbling up that to pay attention to, and it might be an issue here because of your geography, but it's an issue everywhere, is the light at night issue. And what that's about is studies that have been done on workforces that work extended periods of time on night shifts. So they're exposed to artificial light all night, and then they're in daylight when they're not, so they don't have nighttime. And it really has an impact on their melatonin levels, which have been associated to a number of conditions, including increased risk of breast cancer. So we're paying attention to that. Hospital workers, shift workers, people who work nights for any number of reasons, or people who are in the dark for long periods of time and using artificial light. How do we deal with that? And the kind of artificial light, I think, is part of what has to be teased out. So those are some of the highlights in the state of the evidence, and you can also find the report on breastcancerfund.org. Not only the report, the entire science report, but our website is set up in such a way that you can look at the science, you can look at the personal action, and you can look at the policy initiatives. Okay, so I want to just talk in the closing in my closing minutes, I think I'm still doing all right, about a couple of other key themes that emerged that we should be paying attention to as we look at this chemical soup that we're in. One key issue is the timing of exposure that we talked about a little bit earlier, whether it's in utero or early life, or basically when your cells are in a state of rapid development as they're growing or maturing or changing, they're much more vulnerable. And low doses matter. We've talked about that. Mixtures matter. We are not exposed to one chemical at a time. We have a whole slew of genes. We have a whole slew of exposures, whether it's the X-ray that we just had on top of the hormones that we just took and the products we just used. They all interact with each other. So they mix together and they interact together. So no one factor stands alone. We have not studied real-life exposures to chemicals. We tend to take them one at a time. We put them in the laboratory. We see what they do or don't do, but we don't regard the fact that they are in combination with and mixed with and interact with. I talked a little bit about the President's Cancer Panel report to President Obama calling for addressing the issue of cancer in the environment as a real national tragedy and imperative. The World Health Organization has issued a declaration for primary prevention of cancer with an emphasis on environment and occupational exposures. This fall, the President's Cancer Panel will be addressing cancer prevention. I mean, the word prevention now, I just ask us all to say it as many times as we can. Just include it in, don't be afraid of it. Don't be afraid of talking about primary prevention. And all of this science stuff is really important. But what we don't have yet is a government that backs us up with the science that we know. And one thing that we definitely need in the public policy arena is sweeping chemicals policy reform. And that's the overhaul of the Toxic Substance Control Act. And I know that many of you in Alaska, and certainly Pam and ACAT, have been very, very involved in this federal legislation, which was reintroduced this year. And it would totally change how the Environmental Protection Agency tests and regulates chemicals in commerce that are under its jurisdiction. It's an imperative that we do that. We have a head of an agency that wants to do it, and what we need is to be able to pass the legislation to make it happen. Therein could be our concern that we might not get that job done in this Congress, but it shouldn't stop us from keeping this front and center. Every bit of progress we make will break this down. And there's a tremendous coalition working on that. There's another bill that, as I told you, the bisphenol A ban on infant formula, sippy cups, and baby bottles. It's a start. That bill is languishing. You can see more about that on our website. We're starting a markets campaign on BPA. The month of July is Kick the Can. Kick the Can month, where we ask people to avoid canned food and to write to can manufacturers. It's a good month to avoid canned food because you can probably get a lot of fruits and vegetables, but to send letters to can manufacturers telling them you want them to do everything they can to replace BPA with a safe, non-toxic lining that they are transparent about and that they tell us what is in that alternative product. There'll be a bill that will be introduced, if not this week, then next week. The Safe Cosmetics Act is being reintroduced, which would overhaul the FDA's regulation of personal care products and cosmetics. And I want to say, in Europe, 1,100 chemicals were banned from personal care products. And this is back in like 2003 or something. The FDA has banned 9, most of which aren't even in personal care products. So I just want to give you a perspective on that failure. So one way, one way to push for the federal legislation that we need is to also create a bit of havoc in the states. There's nothing that the federal legislature, the legislators like less than to have a mix match of policies in different states that aren't harmonized, because industry goes crazy. If BPA is banned in infant formula in Iowa, but it's not in Connecticut, and if suddenly you've got this patchwork of policy. So state policy has a tremendous capacity to push federal policy, and vice versa. Federal policy would set the floor of regulation, and states can actually, oftentimes, go beyond what the federal government can. So never underestimate the power of one state to actually create national change. And what can you do as an individual? People ask that all the time. When we surveyed the readers of State of the Evidence before this edition, whether they were scientists, advocates, policymakers, public health officials, they also wanted to know what they could do. So we do address that in the State of the Evidence document and on our website. And what we talk about is contribute to your own and your family's health and wellness by reducing exposures where you can. While we can't shop our way out of this, become an informed consumer and make your demand for safe products, and that will move the market. You can do that by creating a healthy home. It's always a good place to start. What household cleaning products are you using? Personal care products? Can you buy fresh, local, sustainable, organic when you can? Can you think about using the fewest number of cans? Or if they say BPA free, go to our website and see if they've told us what it is that they're using instead. And think of ways to make your workplace safe for you, your colleagues, and invest in a deeper understanding of the chemicals that are used and the processes in your workplace. If you're in an office, what's it being cleaned with, right? Every time you choose a product that is less toxic, especially on a broad scale, like a workplace, you're protecting a factory worker who had to work with it, somebody who had to transport it, somebody who had to dispose of it. So if you're a healthcare provider in an institution, think about things like, are you giving away free personal care products to women with breast cancer? Do you know what's in them? There are programs that actually give away products that have carcinogens and endocrine disruptors in them. Are the donated goods that you're working with in your nonprofit or your hospital toxic? Visit safecosmetics.org. You can look up your personal care products. There are 35,000 of them that are up there on a website designed by the Environmental Working Group. You can find out what's safer. Use as little plastic as possible, not just to protect ourselves, but the oceans are full of this plastic that is just killing our oceans and everything that's trying to live in that. Think about the radiation guidelines and mammography guidelines in your own breast health center, and I'm sure you have a lot more ideas that you can contribute. I'm hoping to hear from you all what's going on here in Alaska, because we want to add our voices to yours in the work that's being done. So I think I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
I would like to thank our presenter for taking the time to be with us today and for sharing her expertise. We would now like to open the lines for questions and comments. Please wait a moment while we... As a reminder, we invite you to use the blog if you'd like. To do so, go to healthandenvironment.org, click on News and Events, and then on Working Group Calls. You'll find today's calls listed there. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please press *6 on your telephone to unmute your line, and please state your name and affiliation. We also ask that you please try to be brief with your comments to allow others the opportunity to speak as well. If you're not asking a question, we'd appreciate if you would leave your line unmuted to reduce background noise. Once again, press *6 to unmute your line. Would anyone like to ask a question? Somebody's breaking up, I think. Well, Jeanne, this is Samantha, and eventually I'd like to see Alaska offer more green chemistry policy initiatives. Is there anything that we could use California as a model for? Because it really hasn't been, something we've looked at in the legislature here.
Well, California passed a sweeping green chemistry initiative. You can actually Google around and find the whole green chemistry program. I say it's a sweeping initiative, and there's still quite a bit of debate within it as to how to implement it. And so I think there'll be a lot of learning from it, looking at how will you assess safe alternatives, who will test them, who will actually be the certifier of them. So I think that investment in green chemistry needs to... tremendous investment from the federal government needs to come, and I know the EPA is doing some investment in it. We have to have people who understand it well enough to be able to look at, say, for example, BPA, bad chemical. How can we get something that lines food cans? And someone comes up with BPS. And you think, well, that's a good idea. Well, how do we test BPS and how do we certify it? So I think that the safe alternative for chemicals mass-produced is a ways off. I think that what will spur that innovation, we have a country that's really smart. I think what will spur it will be if you know that you can't have BPA in your food cans, they are going to come up with something. Industry will invest a tremendous amount of money as long as we have the regulations to screen them. So I would track the California program as a model, but it will take a lot of money.
Okay, thank you, Jeanne. Would anyone else like to ask Jeanne a question?
I would.
Great. Can you please?
My name is Mary. I'm not affiliated with anybody. I was wondering if your institute has looked at the recombinant hormone that's used to increase milk production in cows, and whether that's had an effect on breast health, and then also whether just insulin growth-like factor that naturally occurs in dairy has increased breast
And
cancer.
I'm sorry I didn't mention that. Thank you for bringing it up. There is a section on bovine growth hormone and in the in the state of the evidence and zeranol as well. They're rising concerns, and there definitely is a link. It's less strong a link, but it's definitely there. And as our report would basically, if you read it, would have you want to avoid that.
Oh, do you avoid that by not drinking milk at all, or by going organic, or?
Yeah, it's organic. I mean, ensuring that the milk that you get is hormone free, and I don't know if it's labeled that way here. I know it is in California, and that is important. I would stay away from it. So you can actually just, when you open up the document, State of the Evidence, do a search for that, and you'll find the commentary on it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Are there any more questions?
Well, you can also send us questions at info@breastcancerfund.org, and if something comes up later. And I'll just leave by saying it's great to be here, and I really hope you'll all be especially attentive to the work of ACAT. They are doing amazing work in this environmental field and connecting this issue to the broader issue, and certainly deserve your love and support. So thank you.
Thank you again for joining us today. I'd like to mention that Jeanne will be starting her Alaska lecture tour tonight in Anchorage, 7 p.m. lecture at the Anchorage Museum, Fairbanks lecture on Thursday at UAF Scheibel Auditorium, 7 p.m. lecture, and she'll be in Homer this Friday, 7 p.m. lecture at the Pratt Museum. All lectures are open to the public. More information can be found on our website, akaction.org. If you have additional questions or comments, please feel free to contact us at 907-222-7714 or email Samantha at akaction.org. Thanks and have a great day.